Congress has drafted legislation to clamp down on the drug flow that is killing at least 70,000 Americans a year, Rubio wrote, but there is a group of progressive activists, including some Biden administration insiders, who would delay these actions. Some frame drug legalization and harm reduction as the answers to all our problems. Others are not as naive, but they believe a climate deal with Beijing is worth withholding sanctions on Chinese drug dealers. The draft legislation includes the Combating Illicit Xylazine Act, the Fend Off Fentanyl Act, and the Halt Fentanyl Act, which is designed to curb other fentanyl-like invented drugs, he said. Rubio said he is also pushing legislation to list fentanyl precursors as illicit drugs and sanction Chinese institutions that facilitate illegal drug transactions through money laundering. He wrote, "This is not a partisan issue for most Americans. Cartels, gangs, and mobs are flooding our streets with poison. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying as a result. If we don't try to protect them, we aren't worthy of being called public servants. Strong action and sanctions against Chinese companies are a problem for influential lobbies in D.C., partly because China's government can retaliate against investors who rely on China's manufacturers or consumers." On July 20, Homeland Security Chief Alejandro Mayorkas claimed that the United States needs help from China to slow the flow of drugs from Mexico. China bears responsibility. We need their assistance in interdicting the chemicals and pill presses that are going in volumes that don't reflect legitimate use. Mayorkas did not suggest the government would impose economic pressure on China. Political pressure in D.C. has already minimized U.S. economic pressure on Mexico, where the drugs are manufactured from Chinese-supplied chemicals. For example, on July 25, lower-level Biden officials announced a toothless deal over drug smuggling. But a few days later, White House officials inked an agreement that rewards Mexico for regulating the flow of international migrants into the U.S. economy. The migration agreement suggests that the Biden administration has been willing to sacrifice a deal on the drug smuggling problem to get the migration deal that it wants, Jessica Vaughn, policy director at the Center for Immigration Studies, told Breitbart News. The drug problem is getting worse as the China-backed cartels mix new compounds to make Americans more dependent, the New York Times reported in January. "I'd wake up in the morning crying because my arms were dying," Ms. Tracy McCann, 39, said. In her shattered Philadelphia neighborhood, and increasingly in drug-hot zones around the country, an animal tranquilizer called xylazine, known by street names like Trank Dope and Zombie Drug, is being used to bulk up illicit fentanyl, making its impact even more devastating. Xylazine causes wounds that erupt with a scaly dead tissue called eschar. Untreated, they can lead to amputation. It induces a blackout stupor for hours, rendering users vulnerable to rape and robbery. When people come to, the high from the fentanyl has long since faded and they immediately crave more. Because xylazine is a sedative and not an opioid, it resists standard opioid overdose reversal treatments. Since his 2011 arrival in the Senate, Rubio has moved towards a populist criticism of Washington, D.C. In June, he released a book that sharply criticized the federal immigration policy and said it is driven by Wall Street's desire for more immigration. This country has prioritized the importation of cheap labor, including legal cheap labor, he said in his book, titled Decades of Decadence: How Our Spoiled Elites Blew America's Inheritance of Liberty, Security, and Prosperity. Rubio continued. Across this country today, the immigration system has been corrupted and exploited. And it began, as many of America's problems do, with the fundamental shift toward a globalized economy. But not every business could be exported, which meant Wall Street simply figured out how to import cheap labor, much of it clarification, not all, coming from illegal immigrants. This was a slower, more subtle process. Sure, some politicians made a big deal about jobs Americans wouldn't do, but otherwise the only outcry came from workers who found their wages stalled, benefits cut, and hours slashed until they could be replaced by someone willing to work more hours for less. More often than not, it is about jobs Wall Street doesn't want Americans to do because hiring Americans would require higher wages and better working conditions. To them, it is better to import cheap labor and buy off Americans with cash welfare programs provided by the government. Overall, Biden's administration has not exerted itself or ditched any its own pro-migration priorities to help combat the growing damage from drugs. It remains passive amid the growing death toll and the videos showing discarded Americans, more of whom now prostitute themselves to fund their drug needs.